Good evening, everyone, and welcome to the Brian Crombie Radio Hour on Saga 960. It's a real pleasure of mine tonight to introduce you to Holly Doan, who is a journalist, an online publisher, a TV documentary producer, and she is publisher of something called the Blacklock Reporter. Blacklocks.ca is the website, and she's got a really quite fascinating story of the name, how they chose the name, and what they're trying to do. Holly, welcome to the show. How are you?
I'm terrific. Great to be here. Trapped in our living room at time of recording again for the foreseeable future. But here we are, 2022,
well,
making
so
the best
it's
of
probably
it.
a great time to talk about online journalism then.
Right. Online journalism is something that you can do from your living room.
So tell me, you've got a really impressive background. You're the publisher of Blacklocks Reporter. You were a documentary producer for CPAC. You were the Beijing bureau chief correspondent for CTV. You were a reporter for CBC. You were a news anchor reporter for CFRN TV in Edmonton and CFQC in Saskatoon and CKX TV Brandon. You've got quite an interesting background in journalism. And now you are the publisher, as we mentioned, of Blacklocks. Tell me, first of all, what Blacklocks is.
Blacklocks Reporter is an online daily news website based in Ottawa on Parliament Hill covering federal affairs. That is federal affairs, not politics. We are document journalists, which is a growing niche in the era when documents are ever more available. We are accredited members of the Parliamentary Press Gallery for many years. And as you mentioned, have been in journalism way too long. This would be 39 years, I guess, 2022. Most of the background television, but in 2012, we launched with the belief that Canadians in the future were going to get all their news online. And so we sort of broke away from our traditional employers, those you listed, and in the spirit of entrepreneurship, launched our own website, named for another longtime reporter named Thomas Highland Blacklock, who was president of the Press Gallery in 1922.
So you made a big distinction between what you call it, documentary journalism and politics. What's the difference?
Well, we like to say we cover federal affairs, not politics. That means we're not particularly interested in leadership conventions. We don't care about what the story is today in the Twitter sphere. We don't attend a lot of news conferences or formal announcements. We don't travel on the bus on the election campaign. We cover details, fine details of how we are governed. That is, we cover all committees, Senate and House of Commons. We cover audits, internal audits performed within departments looking for improvements or failures of programs. We cover federal court rulings. We file a lot of access to information, which is a problem right now, as you've probably heard, but we have at any given time about 1,000 access to information requests outstanding. So we cover bills and regulations pillar to post. That sounds tedious, but if you follow the development of policy in Canada, it's not, and it's a niche that I can tell you, Brian, people are hungry for.
Why are people hungry for it? I got the impression that the horse race of who's leader now, and whether whether Trudeau's going to take a walk in the snow and Chrystia Freeland is going to become prime minister, and who's going to stab Erin O'Toole in the back, and blah blah blah, are what people are more interested in. No.
Well, I guess, that's the daily narrative. But if that were the case, if that's all people wanted, they wouldn't be turning away from mainstream media in droves. Why do you think they are?
So you think they're turning away from mainstream media is because mainstream media is only focused on the leaders and on the sort of the front page stuff rather than the meat of what's going on in politics?
I think Canadians have an unsettled feeling that they're not getting the whole story. And certainly the media industry is in dreadful shape. The failure to adapt to the internet era and the loss of advertising revenue and the grave error that was commenced 20 years ago of giving content away for free in the hopes that free content online would promote your dying dead tree newspaper business has led to the degradation of newsrooms. They're empty. And there's a lot of frustration amongst Canadians that reporters are partisan or refusing to tell the whole story. But the fact is, newsrooms are hollowed out. And all of the people like me who've been kicking around for 3 or 4 decades have been retired, bought out, laid off. And journalism is not one of those vocations that you can be taught at Carleton or Ryerson or come out of Columbia with a master's in journalism. It really still is a field that has always relied heavily on the apprenticeship system. I started my career, as you mentioned, in Brandon, Manitoba, getting into the company Pinto 2 nights a week and bumping over rural roads to cover town council in places like Souris and Boissevain and places you've never heard of in Toronto, to learn a craft and to learn how governments spend our money, how policy is made. And that's missing now, because with the degradation of Canadian media and consolidation, that those small outlets, more and more of them, have closed. And there are whole communities in every province that are utterly uncovered. And it's not just places like Cornwall or Red Deer. It's even Ottawa, where they purport to no longer have the manpower to cover committees, bills, and regulations.
We're chatting tonight with Holly Doan, who is a publisher of, it's called Blacklocks.
Blacklock. His name was Thomas Highland Blacklock. He was president of the Press Gallery in 1922 and a First World War correspondent.
And if people want to check it out, is there a website that you could direct?
Yeah, www.blacklocks.ca. And you will see there a collection of headlines and cut lines, but we are behind a firm paywall.
We're going to take a break for some messages and come back more with Holly in just a minute. Stay with us. Welcome back to the Brian Crombie Radio Hour on Saga 960. We're chatting today with Holly Doan, who is a journalist, online publisher, TV documentary producer, and she right now is the publisher of something called Blacklocks Reporter, www.blacklocks.ca. And Holly, I try to go fairly in depth with my interviews. I have the pleasure every night at 6 o'clock to talk to different people for an hour. Well, minus the messages, it's about 47 minutes, but it gives me an opportunity to really meet some interesting people. And I've had the pleasure of doing that in depth. But, it's interesting because people tell me that when I do a little cut for 2 minutes or 5 minutes, I get a lot more viewership. And is that maybe an example of the challenge that you're talking about, is that people want their news in little bite-sized pieces rather than in long essays and exposés?
Well, why can't we do all things? I mean, there are people who will always have an appetite for long reads. In the case of our online, for sure, it is harder to digest the same amount. And so our stories at Blacklocks, for instance, usually range between around 400 words, 400, 600 words. And there's a cat in the room, my apologies. And we find that's, if you 5 of those a day is about what people can digest. Now, does that mean that they have a shorter attention span and less ability to absorb material? Depends how much material you're packing in those small bites. When it's all original information and not a lot of comment, he said, she said, when there is no replication or duplication of other material you're seeing elsewhere, I think there is an appetite for information. It's all about, my background as a television documentary producer would tell you it's all about how you package it. You
said that you cover a lot of committees and in-depth policy work. Are people interested in that? And do committees and that in-depth policy work really have any impact? You get the impression that it's all about what goes on in the PMO that has an impact, and that the committee work is, maybe potentially irrelevant. Oh my gosh, no, I don't think you believe that. I think, when we started covering committees, an interesting thing happened. I mean, committees are a place that is, a perfect exercise
of our democracy. It is a place where people, academics, lobbyists, industry associations, unions can come and present information that we might not know about, that lawmakers have a chance to ask questions and elicit information, and that these committees contribute to the shaping of policy. We noticed something when we started covering them. And first of all, you have to know what you're doing. You can't just dip into them once in a while because they are like a soap opera. There's ongoing development of policy. So what we noticed is that people seemed surprised. Readers, followers on Twitter seemed surprised that there were these American-like hearings going on in Ottawa that they didn't know anything about. How could that be? That this is how bills become law. And we found that the longer we started doing them, the more people started to cite the information that was coming out of these committees. And the fact that people don't know how a bill becomes a law or how it is scrutinized in committee was something we found disturbing. But the beautiful thing about them is that they have been neglected by media in Ottawa. And there's nothing more terrific or maybe disturbing. I mean, terrific from the perspective of an entrepreneur trying to create a product, but disturbing to think that there can be testimony and development of policies in Ottawa in a G7 country, and that nobody in our media pays attention to it. And that's what's happening.
You know, it's I guess potentially interesting and an example. I think of myself as a political junkie and a news junkie, and I do watch committee hearings from the United States, and lots of us have because they are really quite interesting. And I get the impression that, you know, different senators, chairmen of different House committees, et cetera, have real power and real influence over time. And maybe part of that is because they're elected separately from the leader of the party, the presidential candidate. But I've always had the impression that committees in Canada didn't really have that much impact. And
well, in a minority parliament, they are particularly influential. All of these documents, if you've been following Blacklocks, the documents that have been compelled by the Health Committee, for instance, about pandemic mismanagement, about masks and warehouses, about sweetheart contracting, about what was going on at the Public Health Agency. These were all documents compelled by the committees. Much of what we know about how the pandemic was handled came from those committees. And because We Charity, another one. Are they more important in minority? Probably. It's easier to hold the government to account because they don't have a majority on the committees. The Health Committee compelled, there were 992,000 documents about pandemic management. And before Parliament was prorogued before the election, the Privy Council had refused to release them. They released 7,000 documents. Well, at Blacklocks, we fed off those documents for 4 months. There was so much in there. There was who got sole source contracts. There were all the emails between the Prime Minister's office and the departments, and meetings that were set up with lobbyists, and missteps on contracting, details of sole source contracts. Why wouldn't you want to know that?
So how is our body politic better because of the minority government and the stronger committee system, and you're reporting on it?
Information. I mean, the parliamentary watchdog committees have only been able to accomplish so much through the appointee system and the weakness of the laws or the size of the penalties in terms of holding government to account. The media, as we discussed before, has shrunk to the point where there aren't enough journalists to hold government to account. We are living with the collapse of media in a golden era of corruption. So much happens that we don't know about. I mean, we think about the parliamentary press gallery in, I want to say 1912 or so. No, today in the parliamentary press gallery, there are 11 daily newspapers. In 2006, there were 20. In 1912, there were 32. So there is far less scrutiny than there has ever been. So the minority parliament, because it gives the opposition more power to subpoena information, gives us the ability to demand transparency and accountability, as we should expect. Accountability journalism, because government makes information so hard to get, and the Access to Information Act has been butchered, accountability journalism has become a niche. And in the era of online journalism, it has never been easier to get documents. Just because mainstream media doesn't try, doesn't mean you can't. So much of what our government does, and I'm not talking about the PMO, I'm talking about the bureaucracy, is mandated to be posted. There are mandated internal audits that tell us about the success of programs. They're all there, but you have to know how to find them. And government doesn't make it easy. So minority parliament is really just another tool for MPs from all parties to find out how well you're governed. It's exciting.
It is. It's very interesting and exciting. You used a term though that we went by so quickly. I've got to come back to it. I think you said a golden era of corruption. Is that what you said?
Mm-hmm. This has been long predicted, because without media to act as a watchdog, there's much that is not being examined.
Do you really believe that we're in a golden era of corruption in Canada?
If you were reading Blacklocks for the last 2 years, you would think so. You would hear about factories in Quebec that were getting sole source contracts for masks, even though they didn't even have a factory. You would hear about former Liberal MPs who were getting sole source contracts to produce ventilators that had not been approved by Health Canada. You would hear the failure of a contract that went to a company that produced testing kits that had not yet been proved to be effective, and later turned out the technology didn't work. You would find out about all the lobbyists who did get contracts for their clients. I mean, you may look at those stories and say, well, that, it was pandemic. We had to move quickly. We had to find companies that could produce the PPE and the testing and procure vaccines as fast as we could. But don't you think that there's a level of transparency that should be applied to that tells us who's getting the contracts and why they're sole sourced and where they're going? That's critical. That's critical to accountability. We heard some of that in We Charity, didn't we? We heard a little bit about that.
Do you think the We Charity disclosure was helpful?
I think it wasn't so much what happened with We Charity as the fact that we didn't know about it. And then we did, that is useful, because it's never going to happen quite like that again, is it? There will be more due diligence. There will be more scrutiny, I would hope. I mean, I'm hoping that media learned something from that. Because as I said, it wasn't so much what happened as how it happened.
So I've gone to a couple of different We Charity events and thought they were excellent, and really had the impression that there were more young people motivated to do good works by that organization than almost any other organization, other than maybe UNICEF, that got some of us when we were kids to go out and get pennies on Halloween. And it almost seemed to me like for a small amount of money that was assumed to be a conflict of interest, partisan reasons, we destroyed a great charitable organization and chased it out of Canada. I guess you don't agree with me.
47 million is not a small amount of money, and they needed that amount. They needed that money. So, if as you say, and if you believe that about We Charity, I don't want to argue, but then they will rise again. Right?
So your argument is that there is a lot of information in committees and in documents that because of the internet that has broken the former business model for newspapers and journalism, we don't have good investigative journalism. We don't have good, thorough reporting, and your organization provides that.
I loathe to call ourselves investigative journalists. That sounds so important, and it sounds like investigations that happen for months, maybe like the Fifth Estate still does. I refer to us as online document journalism. I mean, we're producing 5 original stories a day that do not come from news conferences or question period. or announcements. Original stories, they all come from documents, from things that you think ought to be covered anyway. So today, for instance, off the top of my head, we have news that the Afghan ambassador who fled Kabul and left 1,200 Canadians behind, who had been requested to appear before MPs at committee to answer questions about what happened, was on Christmas Eve announced that he was being sent to Buenos Aires and would not be available. The information on his appointment was withheld for 5 days until Christmas Eve. That's an example of the very simplest of announcements or documents that are filed that are not covered.
So you're saying there's a cover up there?
I don't think there's a cover up. That's the thing. And this is where I become a little bit uncomfortable that people say, oh, cover up between the government or media for not reporting it.
Well, one would think that typically if you're announcing something Christmas Eve, you're trying to hide the fact that the gentleman is the former ambassador is not available. So you didn't want people to pay attention. So it's
you don't want to pay attention to that because it was a disaster, the exodus from Afghanistan. Also on Christmas Eve, or over the Christmas holidays, I should say, there was a regulatory notice by Environment Canada with a figure that we have been trying to get for quite some time, that the elimination of single-use plastics was going to cost consumers $205 million. They had refused to give that piece of information in the past. Also, some of the regulations were to take effect on December 31st, just passed, and that deadline was missed. And they said in the regulatory notice, they confirmed that this stringent reduction of plastics would not begin its first year until 2024. That's something else you do in the Christmas holidays, by a regulatory notice, because you hope that no one will be looking. Why? I mean, we don't know if this is investigative journalism. Maybe you think it is. I think it's just covering the sort of things that maybe we once expected media to cover.
And so, and so, what's wrong with the current business model? Why don't regular media do that?
Well, I think there was a failure to take action when it first became evident that the newspaper, we call it the dead tree business, was dying. They tried a few things like tablets, and they made it free, and then they paywalled again, and tried to reboot the advertising. But I think they left the reinvention of the business model too long and really just sold off pieces of the house bit by bit as they tried to meet shareholders' expectations, and hollowed out newsrooms to the point where now it's very difficult to have the amount of labor that is required to learn how to do those kind of things. And as I mentioned before, I think that journalism is an apprenticeship system where the young ones learn from the wizened old nicotine-stained editor who will say, no, that's not a lead, kid. Get back to your desk, read that report again. That's missing now. And we hear tales of stories posted where they weren't even thoroughly vetted. In the desperate rush to feed the beast and get enough to fill the white space today, if you can't come up with an original story, you will go with the news release and try to find an angle on it. And that's always been true. That was true when I worked in television. But now there are so few reporters who either know how or are available to learn how to do document journalism or the enterprise reporting required to at least give Canadians the feeling that they're getting the news. And if they don't have the feeling that they're getting the news, or if these guys over there can get that story, how come you didn't tell me about the ambassador? That was Christmas Eve. The ambassador was appointed on Christmas Eve. We sat on the story the whole of the holidays. Nobody touched it.
We're chatting today with Holly Doan, who is the publisher of Blacklocks Reporter. Holly, remind us, how do we get Blacklocks Reporter if we're interested?
Well, if you look at the main webpage, blacklocks.ca, you'll see a little red triangle in the upper left, just underneath Tom Blacklock's nose, that says subscribe now. And it will take you to the subscription page. You can get a little feeling if you scroll down through the headlines there. We provide a cut line with a little bit of information. The cost is $3.14 a month. which people nowadays think is pricey after a generation of Canadians being trained that journalism has no value. But I'll tell you something that happened, Brian, in the last, that we don't hear that anymore, that 314 is too expensive. After acquiring a mass of, yeah, there's the subscribe now. That's a Cabinet Watch. See, that is also behind the paywall. That Cabinet Watch is a list of all the appointments of orders in council. There's also another button there that will tell you about all the federal court applications filed coast to coast. We have a trolling software that collects all the applications as they are filed. We have all the appointments today, all the political appointments. So where was I?
Well, we're just chatting a little bit about how you get to Blacklock, and it's www.blacklock.ca.
Right. So we launched in 2012, and I got to tell you, Brian, there was like many years of buying date expired meat and getting grandma to pay the hockey fees until we made a go of this company. But something happened in 2020 with the pandemic.
People wanted more information.
People were afraid for their families, not only their health, but their livelihoods, their businesses. We now know the importance of small business to the economy. And they weren't getting enough information, or so they felt, from mainstream media. They wanted to know about the specifics of programs and how much they were going to cost and who precisely they were going to benefit. They wanted to know who was getting the contract, who got that $350 million contract, and how and why. So we have, in 2020, after the election of 2019, we noticed an uptick in subscriptions. And throughout the pandemic, it just sort of continued steadily. And then in 2021, they doubled. Our revenues doubled.
Fantastic.
Well, I guess it is, I'm told, for a small business. So we are optimistic that and the resubscription rate has been high, which tells us that if they could just crack open the wallet the first time, that they'll find out all the things they weren't learning from mainstream media. And not because we're smarter or better than any of those other reporters. We are older. We've been around much longer and covered all levels of government, from school boards to provincial legislatures to parliament to the People's Congress in China. So we have just developed a niche. That's all. Like any new business, if you find a niche, particularly online, and even in this era of media collapse, which some people thought we were crazy to go into the media business in the teeth of a media recession. And I suppose we were, because it was a little too hard. We faced subscription problems. We faced skepticism from people who are worried about fake news. We faced copyright ripoffs. We faced all sorts of things. But I think I'm really proud of Canadians. I think they have come a long way. They are starting to learn that journalism has a cost, that it's not free, that it's not about clicks. We don't go for clicks. We hardly do any advertising. It's all about subscription. It's all behind the paywall. Canadians are starting to learn, and I'm relieved. I'm relieved because we're happy with what we do. We're proud of what we do, and we think that transparency and accountability matter, and we make a niche contribution.
We're chatting tonight with Holly Doan, who is the publisher of Blacklocks Reporter, a information source, a investigative journalist, a document reporter, not a political reporter in Ottawa. We're going to take a break for some messages and come back more with Holly in just a minute. Stay with us, everybody. Welcome back to the Brian Crombie Radio Hour on Saga 960. Our guest tonight is Holly Doan, who is the publisher of an organization called Blacklocks Reporter, which is www.blacklocks.ca. It's a online publisher where she focuses. They focus really on committee work, on documents, on Supreme Court reports, investigative journalism, trying to go far more in depth than she believes that regular media can go. Holly, maybe I can ask you a couple of questions about media. You know, there was this show on TV, I think it was called Network or something, where the argument was that because There's been this incredible fragmentation of the media that different people watch, that we're living in these echo chambers, and we end up getting only the news that we're interested in, versus a generation ago where, and this was a US example, but it applied in Canada as well, there were three people, trusted individuals that everyone listened to, and therefore we all got the same information. In Canada, I think we all, got it from Lloyd Robertson or Peter Mansbridge or whoever was the people before that. And we all got the exact same information, and we thought that it was unbiased and thorough. Is the fragmentation of media good or bad?
I think it's going to be good, but we're in a very painful period right now, aren't we? I think that those single sources that we trusted before became maybe a little bit disappointing. And I worked for many of them. Disappointing when people could suddenly go online. It was the internet, wasn't it? So you don't have to believe me what happened at Senate committee. You can go onto the parliamentary website and watch it yourself. And that's just one example, but people started to find out information they could read federal court rulings for themselves without having to go down to the courthouse. So this brought into question a lot of the things about what our media was doing, what our institutions were doing. But, I interviewed Angus Reid about 12 years ago, and he had written a book. I'm struggling to remember the name of it, but it was he postulated in this book that in the future, and this is more than a dozen years ago, that our leaders were going to have more trouble governing Canada, that the parties were going to be fractured, that the country was going to be fractured, and the media, as you say, was going to be fractured. And that he said then that no leader was going to get 40% of the popular vote forevermore. He was right. Mr. Trudeau got 33% in 2019 and then less in the last election. So I think that media is going to become much more like the electorate has become, fractured, diverse, more opinionated, less susceptible to government messages. And that happens when we don't get those messages all filtered through a single voice. So less susceptible to government message control. Well, I say great. We haven't learned yet exactly how to harness and deliver. And you see the government fumbling around with that when they talk about regulation of the internet, when they talk about a registry for media outlets. But for sure, the days are gone when cabinet could golf with the publisher of the Toronto Star or the Globe and Mail, and there would be a single message delivered to the electorate. It's not going to be that way, and I don't golf.
The other trend has been toward, blurring the lines between news and commentary or editorial, hasn't it?
Mm-hmm. Well, this is interesting. So there are far more declared opinion pieces as a proportion to the news whole in our newspapers than there used to be. I would say, and Rex Murphy laughed at me once when I said that's because opinion pieces are just cheap fill. And reporters many of them are actually expensive, sitting around, doing nothing every day. You have to get a story today. But it's not just the proportion of news to opinion pieces in the mainstream press. The rise of many of the independent outlets has been the rise of activist journalism. So media outlets that have declared single focus, whether it's climate change and the environment, let's say. And I think now I'm a free speech advocate. I don't have any problem with different voices coming from different perspectives. I don't mean just partisan points of view, there's that too, but even ones that want to report single issues like climate change. I think the more the merrier, the more voices the merrier. Canadians will decide. I do have somewhat of a problem with activist journalism not declaring themselves as activist journalists. They have abandoned the principle of objectivity and fact-finding, and they are highlighting what they would call responsible journalism. In other words, it's responsible to tell everyone they must be vaccinated, that we must declare a climate emergency. And I think, well-meaning, they miss the fact that Canadians right now are very, very skeptical of all these voices. And activist journalism, well, as I'll say again, free speech, is tarnishing other media that still attempts to just report the facts. I think they color us all with their activism because, as you say, people can't tell the difference anymore between messaging, between what is old-fashioned Blacklocks style fact-based journalism, and what it's doing is turning everybody off everything. Oh, they're all the same. They're just a bunch of activists. And so I think that when I say we're feeling our way towards finding more voices and more models, I believe that. And I think there will be more. We are in a period of upheaval. And just as the pulp industry upset the newspaper industry, so the internet, once again, has upset the news industry. But one fly in the ointment is that we don't really know which of these outlets is going to be successful and user supported, so long as there are media subsidies propping up failing business models. Again, I don't have any problem with charitable foundations supporting activist journalism as long as it is declared. But when your main subscriber is the Minister of Heritage, and it on his approval, let's face it, or the Minister of Revenue who signs the requests, that your future depends, it further increases Canadian skepticism and delays our progress towards a rejuvenated, healthy, independent media that Canadians can trust. And once you lose the trust, it's devastating. This is my fear.
So you don't think the government should subsidize CBC?
Well, I'm a former CBC reporter. I actually do support public broadcasting. I am not one of those defund the CBC. I think we have to have a serious, remember when we had royal commissions in this country? The McDonald Commission actually helped us decide on free trade and helped shape public policy. I think we have to have a return to royal commissions. I think the CBC's mandate needs to be overhauled. I think that they still could provide a really valuable service, but they have failed in the minds of Canadians, and I'm talking about the marketplace, when all of their, according to Numeris, all of their supper-hour newscasts combined don't add up to 250,000 viewers. The marketplace is telling you something. So before we lose Canadians, we lose the CBC altogether, let's reevaluate it and restructure it and focus and let Canadians trust public broadcasting again. Why not?
So I spent a fair amount of time watching cable news in the United States, and some of the evening programs are more entertainment than they are news, and very opinionated. And the whole news program really might be an editorial or column rather than actual hard news. But it's enjoyable and it's interesting. Should we have more of that or less of that in Canada?
In Canadian news or on the CBC?
Both.
I don't like the opinion pieces that CBC has introduced. That's me. I think it's cheap fill, and I think it's done more harm than good in terms of reinvigorating people's faith in the CBC, if that's what we want to do. I think in the new independent media that has arisen, I think there is quite a lot of entertainment and partisan point of view. I don't think, I mean, maybe it's not as good as the stuff you're watching in the States, but they have a bigger audience and more money. I think we have enough of it. I mean, if they're all like that, then who's left just doing the news? Who's just left holding governments and corporations to account if everybody's entertaining?
So I do watch Power and Politics as an example, and I find that show is almost all talking heads and all opinion, and very little investigative journalism or fact finding or fact reporting. Am I right in that regard?
Well, those are interview shows, and they don't have a large audience, quite frankly. I think with the CBC show, I think that the recent ruling by the CBC ombudsman that they had to do a little bit more of declaring the contracts and the biases of their guests was helpful. I think that Canadians have a right to know those sort of things when the commentators have, a contract with the Department of Industry. I think that there's an incredible amount of pressure to fill those shows every day. I know from working in television, their producers are young journalists who don't have a lot of experience. Their first job might be on Parliament Hill. Can you imagine? I spent 11 years in the field before going to Ottawa, and I was still horrified and terrified every single moment. So I think that if you are disappointed in the quality of those shows, I think it's because they really don't have a lot of time to do a good job. And I think their purpose is to fill some Canadian content programming requirements anyway. But they miss a lot of things. I was watching the show you mentioned the other day, and they had someone on who they were interviewing from a group called Clean Prosperity. And they referred to the spokesman from Clean Prosperity as a non-partisan group. Well, if you'd read Blacklocks, you would have known that the elections commissioner had just fined Clean Prosperity for illegal elections advertising. Apparently, they're not nonpartisan. So if you don't know that, I thought that's something you should know before you watch a show like that. And if Canadians are learning that sort of thing online, then that makes them mistrust. It makes them mistrust the people who are delivering the messages on the shows. So I think there's nothing wrong with razzmatazz and partisanship and showmanship. Why not? I think we're kind of small town cheap in that department.
One of the things that you mentioned earlier and that is on your front page is Federal Court Watch, and I think we all have been educated over time about how important the Supreme Court is in the United States, but may not realize how important the Supreme Court is in Canada. And I've recently become educated as to sexual orientation rights and issues like that, which were never legislated, but were completely put in place by the Supreme Court of Canada. Is watching what happens in the Supreme Court of Canada important?
Well, yes, of course, in short. And I think the media still does a reasonably good job of covering the major cases that come before the Supreme Court. But the Federal Court Watch on Blacklocks site is not the Supreme Court. That's the federal court. Nobody pays attention to the federal court. John Turner created the federal court 50 years ago, exactly 50 years ago, as justice minister, because the cases where corporations and individuals were suing under federal statute were clogging up the provincial courts. And also Turner's vision was that we would have a place where the little guy can go to sue the federal man. And so if you sue under federal statute, you go before the federal court. So it's predominantly civil litigation. And there's lots there. There is lots there. And nobody covers. You could read the newspaper for the next 6 months. You won't see a federal court ruling. But we have that trolling website there to alert us, not only our subscribers, but to alert us to cases, because it's a fountain. It's a fountain of stories that no one else is touching.
We're chatting tonight with Holly Doan, who is the publisher of Blacklocks, a reporter. Remind us, if you could, how people can check you out.
Blacklocks.ca. We are Parliament Hill accredited journalists in Ottawa since 2012, and we are an online website, 5 original stories daily, paywalled. Click on subscribe now, and that's how you find us.
We're going to take a break for some final messages and come back with some concluding comments in just a minute. Stay with us, everybody. Welcome back to the Brian Crombie Radio Hour on Saga 960. We're chatting today with Holly Doan, who is the journalist, online publisher, TV documentary, and she's currently the publisher of Blacklocks Reporter, www.blacklocks.ca, which is an online newspaper journalist, government document reporter, etc.
You're
Holly,
adding more words every time.
Holly, are you partisan? If you're against the government all the time, you must be, right?
Well, that's what Twitter thinks. And if Twitter says it, it must be true. I think there's accountability journalism is a niche because we're covering waste, mismanagement, cronyism. So in this partisan world we live, there's an automatic sense that if you're covering those things about the government, you must be partisan. But I can tell you, we launched in 2012, so we were around for the first 3 years of the Harper administration. Brian, we didn't have one damn conservative subscriber until after 2015. So funny about accountability media, your friends always change. And if you go around thinking that your friends are in party A or party B, well, they're just going to drop you after they form government. And I'll tell you a couple of funny stories. There was a conservative staffer who tweeted something like, yeah, when we were in government, there we had an unwritten rule in our office, quote, don't talk to Blacklocks or Bob Fife. I'll take that as a compliment. But the best compliment ever came from a female staffer of a conservative senator who said to me one day, you guys you're doing an amazing job. When we're in government, I will hate you. That's as good as it gets in Ottawa.
Accountability, transparency are great as long as it's on the other guy.
As long as you're doing it to the other guy, right? So we expect that if the government were changed, we're gonna lose a lot of subscribers and gain a lot of new ones. But I can tell you, the first round of subscribers came from the union movement when we were covering Harper's legislation aimed at union transparency. That's where our first hardcore support came from, was all the public and private sector unions. And they've stayed with us because they know that their issues, like all the issues of the people who follow us in industry associations and unions and universities and environmental groups, their issues will stay the same. Governments change, Blacklocks doesn't.
Holly, let me ask you one last question, if I could, before we go. This past weekend, the Globe and Mail actually ran a whole series of questions about the future of democracy, primarily focused on the United States because of what happened a year ago, January 6th, 2001 in the United States. Are you optimistic or pessimistic about democracy in Canada today?
I think we're going through a bad time, but I am optimistic we'll come through it. I think that eventually we'll harness the internet for good, and there will be more citizen participation. And I think the media will eventually rebuild itself. And I think with continued media strength, that governments will be better. I think parliamentary watchdogs will improve. Everybody can see that they have to. And I'm at the moment quite dark, but I have to believe, and this is absolutely true in politics, what you see now is not necessarily how it's going to be tomorrow. And anybody who's been hanging around Canadian government for this long, you've been following politics, knows that is absolutely the case. I think it'll be better.
Holly Doan, publisher of Blacklocks Reporter, www.blacklocks.ca. Thanks so much for joining us and tell us a little bit about investigative journalism and accountability journalism and Blacklocks Reporter. Really appreciate it. Thanks so much.
Really great to talk to you.
Thank you so much.